In the summer of 1914, Europe stood at the height of its power. Empires stretched across continents. Kings and emperors ruled over millions. Railways connected capitals. Industry thrived. Trade flourished. Many believed modern civilization had made large-scale war unthinkable. They were wrong. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, a single gunshot shattered that illusion. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist. What could have remained a regional crisis instead ignited a chain reaction of alliances, mobilizations, and ultimatums. Within weeks, Europe descended into war. But the Great War did not begin only with an assassination. It began with tension. For decades, rivalries had hardened across the continent. Germany, newly unified and industrially powerful, sought recognition and influence equal to Britain and France. Britain guarded its naval supremacy. France sought security after losing territory to Germany in 1871. Austria-Hungary struggled to contain nationalist movements within its multi-ethnic empire. Russia positioned itself as protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans. Europe had divided itself into two major alliance systems: the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Each alliance promised mutual defense. Each assumed war would be short. Each prepared for rapid mobilization. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in July 1914, Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany responded by declaring war on Russia. France, bound by alliance, prepared for conflict. Germany then implemented the Schlieffen Plan, a sweeping strategy designed to defeat France quickly by invading through neutral Belgium before turning east against Russia. But invading Belgium brought Britain into the war. By early August 1914, nearly all of Europe's great powers were engaged. Millions of young men volunteered or were conscripted. They marched through cheering crowds, convinced they would be home by Christmas. Instead, they entered a conflict unlike any the world had seen. The early battles in 1914 were fluid and brutal. German forces advanced rapidly through Belgium and into northern France. The French and British armies retreated toward Paris. In September, the First Battle of the Marne halted the German advance. A gap opened between opposing forces, and both sides raced to outflank one another in what became known as the Race to the Sea. By late 1914, neither side had achieved decisive victory. Instead, they dug into the earth. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a continuous line of trenches scarred the landscape of Western Europe. Barbed wire, sandbags, and wooden supports reinforced narrow corridors carved into mud and clay. This was trench warfare. Soldiers lived in damp, cramped conditions. Rats thrived. Water pooled in dugouts. Disease spread quickly. The distance between opposing trenches could be as little as a few dozen yards. Between them lay no man's land, a desolate strip of cratered earth torn by artillery fire. Industrialization had transformed warfare. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Heavy artillery rained shells miles behind enemy lines. Poison gas drifted across battlefields, forcing soldiers to wear primitive masks. Technology outpaced tactics. Generals, many trained in 19th century maneuver warfare, struggled to adapt to the killing power of modern weapons. The result was stalemate. In 1915 and 1916, massive offensives attempted to break the deadlock. At Verdun in 1916, German forces sought to bleed France white. The battle lasted 10 months. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. The phrase, "they shall not pass," became a rallying cry for French resistance. At the Somme, British forces launched an assault intended to relieve pressure on Verdun. On the first day alone, the British army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. The ground gained measured in yards. The losses measured in lives. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war remained more fluid. Russia's vast armies clashed with German and Austro-Hungarian forces across enormous distances. Initial Russian advances were halted at battles like Tannenberg. Over time, Germany's more efficient rail network and coordinated command structure gave it advantages. In the south, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening fronts in the Middle East. Campaigns unfolded in Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula. Soldiers from across the British Empire, Australia, New Zealand, India, Canada, found themselves fighting far from home. World War I was not confined to Europe. It became global. Colonial territories in Africa and Asia were drawn into conflict. Naval battles occurred in the Atlantic and Pacific. German colonies were targeted by Allied forces. At sea, Britain's powerful navy imposed a blockade on Germany, restricting imports of food and materials. Germany responded with submarine warfare. The U-boat became a new instrument of war. German submarines targeted merchant ships supplying Britain. In 1915, the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, which carried American citizens, shocked the world. The United States, however, remained neutral, at least officially. President Woodrow Wilson urged restraint. Many Americans wished to avoid European entanglements. The nation traded with both sides, though increasingly with the Allies due to British naval dominance. But neutrality grew more difficult. By 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, gambling that it could force Britain to surrender before the United States could mobilize. Then came the Zimmermann telegram. Intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, the telegram revealed Germany's proposal to Mexico. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico would be encouraged to join the Central Powers in exchange for territory lost in previous conflicts. When the telegram was made public, American opinion shifted dramatically. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. American entry altered the balance. At first, U.S. forces required training and organization, but American industrial capacity and manpower provided fresh momentum to the exhausted Allies. Meanwhile, in Russia, internal pressures reached a breaking point. Years of war strain, food shortages, and political unrest culminated in revolution. In 1917, the Tsar abdicated. Later that year, the Bolsheviks seized power, promising peace. In 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, exiting the war. Germany now turned its full attention to the Western Front. In the spring of 1918, German forces launched a series of offensives designed to achieve victory before American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers. At first, they made gains, but supply shortages, exhaustion, and stiff Allied resistance slowed momentum. By mid-1918, American troops were arriving in large numbers. At battles like Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, U.S. forces played a significant role in pushing back German advances. The tide had turned. The Allied 100 Days Offensive began in August 1918. Coordinated attacks along the Western Front steadily forced German forces into retreat. Inside Germany, morale collapsed. The naval blockade strained civilians. Food shortages intensified. Political unrest spread. One by one, Germany's allies sought armistice. Austria-Hungary, fractured by internal national movements, began to disintegrate. The Ottoman Empire faced collapse on multiple fronts. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., an armistice took effect. After 4 years, the guns fell silent. But the war had reshaped the world. Empires that once seemed permanent were gone. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, all collapsed or transformed. Europe's political map would be redrawn, yet peace would prove fragile. When the fighting stopped on November 11, 1918, Europe was exhausted. Entire landscapes had been reshaped by artillery. Villages reduced to rubble, fields churned into mud, railways twisted, forests splintered, cemeteries expanded across France, Belgium, Eastern Europe, and beyond. More than 16 million people were dead. Millions more carried wounds that would never fully heal, physical and psychological. But the war's end did not bring clarity. It brought negotiation. In January 1919, representatives of the victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris to shape the peace. The conference was dominated by three leaders: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, and Georges Clemenceau of France. Each arrived with different priorities. Wilson envisioned a new international order based on his 14 points: principles of self-determination, open diplomacy, and collective security. He believed the war had been fought to make the world safe for democracy. Clemenceau, representing a France devastated by invasion, sought security above all else. France had suffered immense destruction along its northeastern frontier. Clemenceau wanted Germany weakened to prevent future aggression. Lloyd George navigated between these positions, balancing British public demands for accountability with concerns about maintaining stability in Europe. The resulting Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms on Germany. Territory was lost. Colonies were stripped. Military forces were severely limited. Reparations, financial payments for war damages, were demanded on a massive scale. Most controversial was the War Guilt Clause, which assigned responsibility for the conflict to Germany and its allies. For many Germans, the treaty felt humiliating. Economic strain and political resentment would simmer in the years ahead. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into new nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Borders were redrawn, often with limited regard for ethnic complexity. In Eastern Europe, new states emerged from former imperial territories, but many faced instability from the outset. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned. In the Middle East, former Ottoman lands were placed under British and French mandates. Lines drawn on maps would influence regional tensions for generations. Wilson's vision for a League of Nations, an international body designed to prevent future wars, was included in the treaty. Yet irony shadowed the moment. The United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. America would not join the League. The nation that had helped tip the balance of the war retreated from direct involvement in European affairs. The war had also transformed societies at home. Governments expanded authority during wartime. Economies shifted to total war production. Civil liberties were sometimes restricted in the name of security. Women entered industrial workplaces in large numbers to fill positions left by enlisted men. In several countries, including the United States and Britain, women gained expanded voting rights shortly after the war. The conflict accelerated social change, but it also left trauma. Soldiers returned to civilian life carrying what was then called shell shock, nightmares, anxiety, tremors, conditions not fully understood at the time. The psychological toll of trench warfare, constant bombardment, and close-quarters combat lingered. A generation of young men had been lost. Writers and artists reflected this disillusionment. The lost generation captured a mood of uncertainty and questioning. Traditional assumptions about progress and honor were challenged by memories of mechanized slaughter. The Great War had shattered confidence in inevitability. Before 1914, many believed Europe was too interconnected economically to wage a prolonged war. Instead, industrial capacity prolonged the conflict. Railroads transported troops quickly. Factories produced artillery and munitions at unprecedented scale. Chemical industries created new weapons. World War I introduced total war, where entire societies mobilized. Civilian populations became part of the war effort through factory labor, food production, and financial bonds. Propaganda campaigns shaped public opinion. Posters, newspapers, and speeches framed the war as righteous and necessary. Censorship limited dissent. The conflict blurred lines between battlefield and home front. On the seas, submarine warfare demonstrated how new technologies could bypass traditional naval power. In the skies, airplanes, once experimental, became reconnaissance tools and later fighter aircraft. By 1918, the war had entered the air. Innovation accelerated under pressure. Yet, despite technological advancement, strategy often lagged. Mass infantry assaults against entrenched positions resulted in devastating losses. Generals learned slowly that coordination between infantry, artillery, and tanks was essential. By the war's final year, Combined arms tactics showed greater effectiveness. But the cost of learning had been staggering. The war also reshaped the global balance of power. European dominance weakened. The United States emerged economically stronger. Japan expanded influence in East Asia. Colonial troops who had fought for European empires returned home with new expectations and questions about imperial rule. In India, Africa, and the Middle East, nationalist movements gained momentum. The rhetoric of self-determination raised hopes. Yet the reality of post-war arrangements often fell short. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 compounded tragedy. As soldiers returned home, a virulent strain of influenza spread globally, killing millions more. The war's end blurred into pandemic loss. For many families, grief came in waves. The Great War did not simply end empires. It destabilized an entire international system. Economic hardship in post-war Europe contributed to political extremism. Germany's Weimar Republic faced hyperinflation and unrest. In Italy, dissatisfaction with post-war settlements fueled nationalist sentiment. The seeds of future conflict were quietly planted. Yet in 1919, many believed they had secured lasting peace. Monuments were built. Armistice ceremonies commemorated sacrifice. Leaders pledged never again. But peace requires more than the absence of gunfire. It requires stability, fairness, and cooperation. The Treaty of Versailles sought to prevent another war through punishment and limitation. It underestimated the depth of resentment that punitive measures could create. Still, the war's lessons influenced military and political thought worldwide. Leaders studied the failures of rigid alliances and mobilization timetables. Military planners examined the stalemate of trench warfare. But few anticipated how quickly Europe would again descend into conflict. World War I had ended in 1918, yet its consequences stretched far beyond. It redrew borders, collapsed monarchies, it empowered new ideologies, it shifted global influence, and it left behind a warning. Modern war, fueled by industry, nationalism, and alliances, could engulf entire continents. By the time the guns fell silent, the world had changed irreversibly. But to fully understand why the Great War ended empires, we must look beyond battlefields and treaties. We must examine how leadership decisions, strategic assumptions, and political rivalries converged to ignite catastrophe, and how those decisions reshaped the 20th century. When historians look back at the Great War, they often ask a difficult question. Was it inevitable? Europe in 1914 was not unstable by accident. It was bound together by treaties designed to deter conflict. Yet those same treaties created a rigid system in which mobilization meant escalation, and escalation meant war. Leaders believed speed would determine victory. Railway timetables were prepared years in advance. Military plans were so precise that once mobilization began, stopping it risked chaos. Diplomacy moved slower than trains. The assassination in Sarajevo did not force Europe into war. It exposed how little flexibility remained. Austria-Hungary feared losing authority over its Balkan territories. Germany feared encirclement by France and Russia. Russia feared diminished influence in Eastern Europe. France feared German aggression. Britain feared a hostile power dominating the continent. Each decision was shaped by fear of appearing weak. Each government assumed conflict would be brief. None anticipated 4 years of industrialized destruction. The war also revealed how nationalism had intensified across Europe. Citizens identified strongly with their nation-states. Newspapers inflamed rivalries. Pride and prestige influenced policy. When war began, it was met with enthusiasm in many capitals. Young men enlisted believing they were defending civilization. They soon discovered that modern war bore little resemblance to romantic images of cavalry charges and swift victories. In the trenches of the Western Front, war became endurance. Weeks of waiting under threat of artillery bombardment. Moments of chaos during assaults across no man's land. The mechanical rhythm of machine gun fire. The thunder of heavy shells. The quiet dread before dawn attacks. Victory was measured in yards. Losses were counted in thousands. On the Eastern Front, mobility returned at times, but the scale remained immense. Russian forces struggled with supply shortages and internal political unrest. Germany and Austria-Hungary coordinated more effectively, yet even victories did not bring decisive conclusion. The Ottoman Empire faced campaigns stretching from the Dardanelles to the deserts of Arabia. British forces, aided by Arab revolts, sought to weaken Ottoman control. Colonial troops fought in unfamiliar climates for empires that often denied them equal status. The global dimension of the war reshaped expectations. Soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand fought on European soil. They witnessed firsthand the vulnerabilities of imperial powers. When they returned home, many carried new ideas about independence and self-rule. World War I accelerated the decline of imperial dominance. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fractured under internal divisions. Nationalist movements sought autonomy. As military setbacks mounted, cohesion dissolved. The Ottoman Empire, long in decline, was carved into spheres of influence. Promises made during the war to Arab leaders, to Zionist organizations, to colonial administrators, sometimes contradicted one another. These contradictions would echo across decades. In Russia, revolution transformed a monarchy into a socialist state. The Bolsheviks' success inspired movements worldwide and deepened ideological divides. The German Empire, once confident in its industrial strength, faced collapse from within. By late 1918, naval mutinies and worker uprisings signaled that the war could not continue. When Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, the empire ended not only through military defeat but political breakdown. For empires had fallen. The war that many believed would affirm power instead dismantled it. Yet beyond empires and treaties, the Great War altered how humanity understood conflict. It demonstrated that technological advancement does not guarantee moral progress. Artillery, gas, submarines, airplanes, innovations designed through science, were applied to destruction on an unprecedented scale. It revealed how interconnected economies could still descend into prolonged warfare. And it showed how fragile diplomatic systems become when trust erodes. The armistice of 1918 stopped the fighting, but it did not restore what had existed before. Europe's map was redrawn, but ethnic tensions remained. Reparations burdened economies already weakened. Political extremism found fertile ground in uncertainty. The League of Nations represented hope, a mechanism for dialogue rather than war. Yet, without full participation and enforcement power, it struggled to prevent future aggression. The memory of the war lingered. Every town in France, Britain, and Germany bore plaques listing the names of the dead. Cemeteries stretched across once fertile fields. Memorials became part of national landscapes. Armistice Day ceremonies paused daily life each November. Silence became ritual. The war reshaped literature and philosophy. Writers questioned old certainties. Artists captured fragmentation and loss. Faith in linear progress weakened. A generation had witnessed modernity's darker capacity. Yet the Great War also fostered resilience. Medical advances improved trauma care. International humanitarian organizations expanded. Efforts to prevent future conflict became more structured. Still, the central lesson remained stark. War among industrial powers would not be short. It would not be contained. It would demand total mobilization, and its consequences would outlast the battlefield. When the Great War ended in 1918, many hoped it had been the war to end all wars. They believed the suffering had been so immense that no nation would repeat it. But unresolved grievances and fragile political systems undermined that hope. 2 decades later, Europe would again descend into global conflict. World War I had ended empires. It had reshaped borders. It had shifted power. But it had not secured lasting peace. The war stands as a turning point in modern history. It marked the end of 19th century optimism. It began a century defined by ideological struggle and global warfare. From the streets of Sarajevo to the trenches of the Somme, from the deserts of the Middle East to the forests of Eastern Europe, From imperial capitals to rural villages, the Great War altered the course of nations. It revealed the consequences of rigid alliances, unchecked nationalism, and strategic miscalculation. And it reminds us that stability, once lost, can be extraordinarily difficult to restore. World War I was not only a military conflict. It was a transformation, collapse of old orders, a warning written in mud and steel, a reminder that decisions made in days can shape generations. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world did not return to what it had been. It moved forward into uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the 20th century began.